Hello everyone, and thank you for coming to April's Post-Diagnostic Support Group. A big welcome and thank you to our guest speakers, Sue and David, who are going to be doing the session today. The topic being working in partnership with educational settings, masking and reasonable adjustments.
Right, well, thank you for the introduction, Kieran. Most people I can see, I know, but anyone that I can't see that doesn't know me, I'm Sue Power, and I'm an education lead here at Axia. As you can see from the title, and as Kieran's already explained, this is going to be a bit about working in partnership with educational settings. I'm going to hand over to David to talk about masking, and then we'll discuss reasonable adjustments. Could you do the next slide, please, Kieran? So, as I said, that's me, Sue Power, Education Lead, and I was appointed in 2018 to liaise with educational settings. So before that time, we didn't really get a lot of information back from schools or colleges when we used to request it. So the idea of me coming on board was to try and have somebody here who could actually do that as their role and try and contact the schools in a little bit more of a timely fashion to make sure that we were getting information back, and also that the quality of the information that we were getting back was helpful. So being able to have discussions with teachers, SENCOs, nursery leaders, tutors, to be able to get information that was going to help the clinicians when they were doing the assessments of the children. I come from a teaching background, so I used to be a teaching assistant for quite a while. And then I was an English secondary school teacher as well for quite a bit. So I understand school from a teacher's perspective, which we were hoping would be helpful when liaising with schools, to have somebody who could see it from the teacher's perspective, also see from the clinician's perspective and the child and the family. One thing that I would say is that from working here at Axia, I think that my knowledge about neurodiversity has improved so much. I think that in school you do get some knowledge working as a teacher, and I think that that is improving all the time. But I do think that working here has really improved what I know about things like autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, and I think that our knowledge should be shared as widely as possible. So that is one of the reasons why it's important to have a little education team who can liaise with schools and try and help share the knowledge that we've got here. Okay, next slide, please, Kieran. This is Tracy. I don't know whether Tracy has been able to join us, but Tracy is our associate teacher. So Tracy came on board last year really to help me with doing the job of gathering all the observations. As we started seeing more and more children, it became quite difficult for me, alongside in my other role as the company secretary, to try and keep on top of gathering all the information. So Tracy's been invaluable in doing that. She also comes from a teaching background and actually still works in school now with catch-up groups and tutoring. So she's got a really good idea of what's happening in schools at the moment, and it's really helpful having her on board to lead on that. Okay, next slide, please. The other person we've got on our education team is Kieran, who you will know from organising the group. So his role is education and events administrator. So obviously over the past year since he's been in post, the events side has been quite slow, apart from the post-diagnostic support group and our Axia away day, but the education side hasn't been slow. And it's really useful having Kieran on board to liaise closely with myself and Tracy, making sure that we've got all up-to-date information for all of the children that we're seeing, and contacting families and helping Tracy to make sure she's got the information that she needs to be able to get in touch with people to gather our observations. And also Kieran helps with following up any queries, anything else that comes in as well. So that's our little education team that we've got here. And I think it's really important that we've got that, and it helps me having Kieran and Tracy, so making sure that everything's being done, and I know that the clinicians find what they do really helpful as well with the information that we get back. Yeah, very much so. Yeah, okay. So next slide, please, Kieran. Just now to just go over, I've sort of covered some of the reasons already. We're talking about why I was appointed and what Kieran and Tracy do, about why it is so important that we do work in partnership with educational settings. So as many of you know, we work within the partnership model here. That's the way that we conduct our assessments. It's the way that we manage the whole of Axia. So our relationships with our staff and associates is all working in partnership with each other. So it only seems to make sense that to work in partnership with schools, to obviously appreciate what they're doing, the fact that a child or a young person is spending a lot of their time there, they're seeing them and being able to get their perspective on things. And I think as well, involving school in the diagnostic process is always really beneficial. So I know sometimes when we see people, they may feel that they don't necessarily want to involve school if they feel at school are not seeing what they're seeing. But I think if we can involve school from the very beginning, maybe if they're not necessarily seeing everything that parents are seeing, to let them know that this process is going to be happening and to involve them, just sets up a good relationship, and it helps them to sort of work with you as well, and it opens a conversation really to maybe be able to discuss the child and get information. It can help to maintain those relationships between the parents and the school as well. And sometimes, like I say, if people have been a bit reluctant to let school be involved, that can help to sort of build those relationships back up a little bit if they're giving us the school's details to be able to contact them and involve them. And again, if you do that and we give ourselves plenty of time to contact the school wherever possible, it usually helps us with being able to obtain really good quality observations. And I know that Tracy has a lot of conversations with teachers where she can really unpick the child, and well, not unpick them, that sounds awful, unpick what's being said about the child. So it made me think of what's that doll with the eyes, sewn on eyes? Anyway, but yeah. Well, no, what's
Coraline?
That's it, the scary one. Yeah. Anyway, I've gone off. So yeah, more being able to have a conversation with a teacher or a Senko and listen to what they're seeing, and maybe then ask more questions to say. So you're saying they've got friends. Who are their friends? How do they play? Are they with the same people all the time? And just really get a better understanding of what the teacher's seeing, and also maybe what they're doing already that they don't realise that they're doing to support children. So that's really important. Going back to what we know here, for us to be able to have conversations, share our knowledge, and think about best practice. Sometimes schools are, really good. They've got lots of ideas. They're already, before children are coming to see us for assessments, putting in lots and lots of different strategies. So that's helpful for us to know if they're doing that and how they're helping people to cope, or maybe if things are not being done, then afterwards we can have a conversation to try and think about what will help. Also, if there are any misconceptions, I think when Dave goes on to talk about masking in a minute, I know I had a conversation with Tracy a couple of weeks ago, and we both agreed that now when you speak to schools about masking, a lot of people will know what you're talking about, which I think has changed, certainly since I started working here, even just over the past couple of years. I think I think a lot of people will know that and maybe recognise that what they're seeing in school, can be completely different, or there'll be a meltdown when someone gets home and they're holding it together in school. But it does give that opportunity to have that discussion if somebody really maybe doesn't know about masking, or they've maybe got a bit of a stereotypical idea of something, that you can speak to people about that. Also as well, I've just realised there's a typo on that slide. Allowing for meaningful, reasonable adjustments. So I think if you have involved the school from the beginning and you've had the conversations with them and you've let them know about the process, then it's so much better than when at the end someone getting a diagnosis or not, but they need a bit of support. It's so much easier then to ask the school to be thinking about reasonable adjustments if they know what's going on and they're involved. We'll come back to it later on, but we always say the best way of doing that is to for the parents, the child or young person, carers, teachers, Senko, to meet and have a discussion about what's going to work for that person, because it'll be different. As many of you will know, it's different for everybody, and what works for one person may be somebody else's idea of hell. They may not want that, but you're not going to know until you've asked that young person and the family what's going to work. And I don't even know how you'd say that word, but it's meant to say achieving the best possible support and outcome for the child or the young person. So whatever's going on, I think, and whatever relationships are good or bad between school and parents, you've always got to remember, at the end of the day, there's a young person there who we're trying to help. And if everyone's communicating, we're trying to get the best outcome for that young person. So I think they're the main reasons why it's really important that we have our education team and that we do liaise with school wherever we can. Okay, I'm going to hand you over to Dave now. Yeah, so your slide there with you. So
you just leave that up there because I'm just going to talk.
Yeah,
sure. So no, thank you, because the whole issue with schools and masking is such an important thing to recognise, and I have seen in Tracy's more recent reports over the last few months that I think that Tracy and you have actually put the word in to the staff you're talking about, and done a lot of explanation as well, because there's more acknowledgement and acceptance that the child could be presenting differently at home compared with school. So I thought it'd be better well, I'll try and define masking first of all. And I think for me, and from what people have told me, is that really it's the suppression, conscious suppression of naturally autistic responses in an environment where the person doesn't feel safe. And they do that to avoid standing out as different. And then you can become a target. And also people on the spectrum, pretty well everybody I meet, hates any kind of social exposure, hates attention being drawn towards them. And so, in fact, that's kind of, I would say that's one of autistic people's greatest fears. Anybody that disagrees, please pipe up, because this is learnt from autistic people. I haven't been reading any. Well, there's some good research about it actually, which backs up, formally backs up what's being said by the autistic population. But I do see it as the suppression of natural autistic responses. So, for example, all the sensory stuff, if things are too noisy, it can be very stressful for somebody on the spectrum. I'll tell you one really good one I always often ask in assessments. When I see a child constantly correcting parents because they're making minor factual errors in what they're saying, I then ask the person, well, do you do that at school? No, stay quiet. So what's going on at home where they can naturally express their genuine concern for truth and accuracy, where they feel safe, they suppress it because they know if they ask, if they come out with something correct to teacher, that's socially challenging, they'll get criticised, get told off, sent to the headmaster, given a detention, or be cheeky, or there'll be some kind of sanction. In a similar way, with some autistic pupils that I meet who do very consistent masking, there are two conditions that these pupils will drop the mask and challenge, and they're very, very autistic reasons and very positive reasons. First of all is the one I've just mentioned. If the teacher gets something wrong, an autistic person cannot resist saying, look, you've just got that wrong. This is, and you're not only got it wrong, but you're telling 30 other people the wrong information. This is the right information. That's one reason. And the second reason, another amazing quality about being on the spectrum, is that very strong sense of justice. And if an autistic pupil sees unfairness, even if it's nothing to do with them, it could be somebody. In some cases, it's with pupils that may have bullied them. Yeah. But with the autistic priority of justice and truth overrides those social considerations and come out and defend somebody that's been bullying you for 2 years is a pretty amazing characteristic. And so I do see there's certain things that override the masking where the mask will drop. But I think it's really important, I think that the understanding behind it is to avoid social exposure. Now, why do autistic people avoid social exposure? Because in the same way that non-autistic people don't have an intuition about autistic thinking, the non-autistic social world is a highly confusing place and often frightening for the autistic person. So that's why you don't want to stick your head above the parapet, sorry about using an idiom, and draw attention to yourself, because every time you have attention drawn to yourself, you could make a social mistake. And pretty well every autistic person has told me from teenage onwards and sometimes younger that they so often become very, very preoccupied and anxious about whether they've got their social interaction right, replaying conversations over and over again in their minds, trying to find an answer to the question, have I done anything wrong? Did I interpret that person correctly? And of course, because of the lack of intuition about it, you never come to a certain conclusion in your own mind. So that's what masking is really about in my mind. So there is this, there are exceptions, of course. When it comes to school, and this is my own journey, and I hate the word journey, journey of learning about autism, I used to expect that autistic people should behave the same in all contexts. I thought, oh, well, you know, you've seen a couple of films about autism, so, you know, I should be able to recognize it, and why would you change? And of course, now I understand that much better, thanks to listening to autistic people, but there's still certain situations where I think I'll be right in saying that if somebody has autism and also an intellectual disability, then there's more chances that they won't mask, that they'll be themselves in different contexts. And also maybe have super sensitive sensory sensitivities that dominate their thinking and their experience, etc., which affect learning and all sorts of things. So yes, some autistic people with an intellectual disability, I think, don't mask so much. And also it's very interesting, I think, I've got a theory, again, from listening to people, that at some stage, from very early development for kind of autistic development, social awareness develops, you know, some social awareness becomes, and it's at that point where a child notices difference and starts to feel different that masking comes in. If you've got a child who's totally on their own agenda before that stage, and it can happen at different ages, then they tend to present the same in different contexts. But it is, you know, which blows the myth, doesn't it, that people on the spectrum don't want to be sociable. Of course, people on the spectrum want genuine friendships and social contact on things that are meaningful to them. But you know, you must think, you wake up and you look at all this language being used and all these kind of social behaviors and people playing together, doing play together, which is kind of crazy because other children are only going to mess up your play, so why would you want them involved? But if you wanted to engage something on you're very interested in, then you would want to socially interact. But so it's a very confusing, and I love Linda's term, you know, confusing and sometimes frightening place, the world, for people on the spectrum. And it's completely understandable why, because you have a very different thinking style and perspective. And completely different priorities in terms of how to interact. It's just very different.
I think as well that, you know, I know that a lot of you have commented about like how young some of the children are who come to see you. So there's, you know, there's evidence of masking as well. Even like someone, I think he was about 5. Yeah, so quite young.
Yeah, but very early, surprisingly early, where And you've got to, you know, and of course I used to complain bitterly about schools, didn't I? And Sue came in as a teacher, thought she was getting beaten up all the time.
Teacher bashing.
Yes. And I've kind of moved on with my thinking about this because, of course, most neurotypical teachers don't have an intuition, just like any other neurotypical person, about autistic behaviour. So it's very difficult to identify. The idea, again, that behaviour should be different in one context to another is difficult to get your head around to start with. I know I found it difficult, and I've been guilty of these things as well before I understood the subject better. Yes, so it's sorry, I'm just looking at my notes. Yes, so I think that describes masking, the reasons for masking, the circumstances where a pupil may take off a mask and challenge, etc. But you've got much more significant cases is where masking goes right into adulthood.
Yeah.
And this is where we see adults who are on the spectrum who have not been themselves for years, for decades often. And one of the most useful kind of diagnostic questions is, do you have a sense of personal identity? And often the people say, no, I don't know who I am, because they've actually just been suppressing their natural responses and communications, where they communicate for years and years and years and got into the habit of it, and often with mental health consequences. I mean, Linda brought us to attention to a really good piece of research. I think one of them was, is it Francesca Happe? Yeah, who did a very good piece of research, which strongly suggested that masking, specifically for the autistic population compared with non-autistic, is a significant factor in suicide ideation and mental health difficulties, which is kind of what I think a lot of people knew for a long time, but it's always great to have good research to back it up. But it is critical, and that's why giving a diagnosis is often so healing. Yeah. I often say to clients, you can now look back over your life without the guilt and feeling of failure, because it's actually because you are different. And I always say that the most protective thing you can do for yourself is to develop a positive identity as an autistic person, knowing where your strengths lie, where your sensitivities are, and to shape your life accordingly to play to all your strengths. But the masking is a major issue. I mean, in small quantities, it must be useful. If you can do a bit of masking, you've got some small talk scripts when it's required of you, or, the social niceties, which are pretty pointless, but you do them because they're important to non-autistic people, that kind of thing. So it is useful to function, but too much of it is dangerous. And I think that's what I wanted to say about it, actually. Has anybody got any other areas to explore relating to that, or any questions or challenges?
Go ahead, Linda.
Okay, so a challenge that I hear, Dave, sorry, this is Linda speaking, Linda Buchan. A challenge I hear, Dave, is, in common with we're all a little bit autistic and we all like routine, all that old nonsense. I hear, we all behave differently in different settings. So, I behave differently in my home where I am now, and I would behave differently at work and differently in a social setting. But I suppose my response to that, Dave, but be interested in hearing yours, is this is not about behaving differently. This is about being frightened of being exposed for who you are.
Yes.
And that is completely different. When I'm at work and I'm behaving differently, I don't have a fear of being exposed for who I am. It is not a way of protecting myself. It's just a way of being socially accepted. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Dave.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I totally agree with that, because the neurotypical adjustments, and quite subtle adjustments to communication style according to context, as I say, are not based on fear. It's based on some kind of neurotypical judgment about what's socially appropriate, use of language, whether you're formal or informal, how much information you have to give or you don't have to give. All those kind of things. We do make those adjustments, but I absolutely agree. It's not based on fear, fear of being exposed, which is dreadful.
Yeah, I suppose as well that the impact that, like, going back to the sort of the mental health impact on people as well, like people having to keep that up for so long, and then, you know, the impact on them for keeping that up, and the exhaustion as well, isn't it? Like, it's not tiring for, say, like, if we come in the morning and you see somebody from another company and it's like, morning, how are you? Nice day. Yeah, lovely, isn't it? You know, all this like conversation, like you say, that you make that isn't really necessary, but you do it because it's polite or whatever.
I mean, the other...
It's not stressful.
No, it's not, is it? You just get on with it. I mean, the other thing, the really dangerous side of this, as we know, is for parents when somebody gets it into their head that the difference in behaviour of their child at school and home is a parenting issue and a safeguarding issue, and social services gets involved, and then it becomes, and it's happening all over the UK, as we all know, I think, where sometimes children are even being taken away. Parents are getting accused of FII. What's it stand for?
Induced and fabricated illness.
Thank you. Yeah, fabricated illness. Yeah, and this. You get all sorts of scenarios where local authorities then conspire and challenge the diagnosis, and you know, we all know what the nightmare is. But it originates in a lack of understanding about why the autistic child presents differently at school, and they're brilliant at it. I mean, you wouldn't. I'm not. You know, it's only because I've learned so much about this subject that because it's difficult to understand how such a young child can use all their energy to suppress these responses in these environments. You'd have thought, oh, I could see it. I know children. You know, I'm very experienced. You know, I'm a teacher. I've said, you know, if one is a teacher, you know, you're brilliant with children. You've got enormous experience and years' experience, etc. But it's so difficult to admit to yourself that you couldn't see it, basically, because you can see when a child is upset because a family's split up, or there's been some, you know, other emotional stuff going on. Teachers support that stuff automatically all the time on an emotional level and trauma level. But you cannot tell if an autistic child is keeping the lid on their responses in the classroom. It's very, very difficult. And also I should say that usually they can only keep it up for so long. And when they move to high school, with the increased social complexity and all the change and the size of the whole thing, then often that's it. It's a mental health crash. You can't cope with that escalation in the number of triggers and intensity of triggers that you're exposed to in high school, and your masking just finishes, and it's very difficult.
Whilst we're still on the topic of masking, we've had a question come through, and I'll read it out to you now. It says, the new paper on masking by Pearson and Rose suggests that masking is a response to stigma and compares it to other social stigma as experienced by otherwise marginalised people, e.g. LGBTQ people, BAME people, etc. Do you specifically take this compounded stigma need to mask into account?
That's a really good question, because there's a similarity there, isn't there? There's fear on both sides, isn't there, of standing out as different. But the only difference, well, one of the differences that immediately come to mind is that somebody in the LGBTQ plus community or other kind of differences does not have the disadvantage of having no intuition about how the social world operates around them. In fact, they understand it very well. If you're neurotypical but different, that's different from being autistic and different, I think. So there's some sort of similarities there, and I think that similarity merits special consideration as masking rather than trying to cover up, which looks similar. But I say it's the underlying psychology is different, although there's anxiety in both. That's how I'd initially respond to that. Has anybody else got any thoughts? Linda.
So I've just, thank you for the reference to that article. I've just got the article up. Obviously, it's a very recent article. It's in a journal called Autism and Adulthood that I wasn't even aware of. And it talks about not imposing gender norms and stereotypes by associating masking with the female autism phenotype, which I think probably that has in the past been, women are very good about covering up. So I'm trying to read it and speak at the same time.
But that makes sense, Linda, doesn't it?
Because it does, doesn't it?
Yeah, masking's been, I think, falsely associated specifically with female presentations.
Yes.
Personally, I feel that, yes, there's been some good research about some superficial differences between male and female presentations of autism, but I personally believe that underlyingly the psychology is the same.
Yeah, it talks about social theory and says that masking is not necessarily a choice, which I think we're saying very definitely it's not a choice really. It also talks about different parts of gender identity coming together that might then impact, and I think it's in what we do in the diagnostic process to try and answer the question. Now I've had a quick look at the article, is particularly when we see young people 14, 15, 16 where they may be struggling with multiple issues around identity in terms of gender, sexuality, neurodiversity, maybe coming from a different ethnic group, maybe looking different as well in their classroom situation, where we see those multiple identity issues. We do take that into account. We obviously in the diagnostic process can't go into that in the depth that probably needs to be done at some point. We try and do that post-diagnostically if it's all possible. But I think it's a very good question about, I've just seen Ellie said, it just makes tough stuff even tougher. And I think that's a really good response that, so at 14, 15, you're struggling anyway, regardless if you're neurotypical, white, heterosexual, whatever, that, because who are you? So I think, I know, Dave, I love diagnosing children at 18 months and 2 years, because then you're starting them off on a life journey of being autistic and being proud of that. I think teenagers, if that's still a word that I should use, it's probably the hardest time to get a diagnosis.
No, it's very interesting. Yeah, because they are associated, these. But as I say, I think, the fundamental diagnostic from an assessment point of view is always, for me, do you have an intuition about social interaction or not? And the clear signs that you don't is that level of uncertainty about being preoccupied about whether you might have made social mistakes or not. And also that you find social interaction so tiring because it takes up so much energy. It's a really strong indicator. I ask people, do you have a hard limit on how much socializing with people that you don't know that well, that is, or not? And it's also useful to say in terms of masking that when I speak to autistic people about this, it's, they can drop the mask at home where they're accepted and they feel safe and loved for the people they are. And also they can drop the mask with very close friends. And they don't have to do all that social overthinking either. So they don't experience the tiredness, they don't experience the self-questioning about whether they got it right or not. And they can genuinely relax. And that's why one of my last pieces of advice to anybody on the spectrum is stick to people that you know and trust.
Yeah.
And SOD, everybody else. And then, you know, that's the way to live your life, isn't it? Stick to your interests.
It's going to work for you, and and not use up too much of your energy on things that don't really matter.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Do we have any other questions, Kieran?
We have had another question come through. So it says, my son is 11, diagnosed September last year, just as he started high school. I have recently noticed he is masking. How best can I support him?
Recently, he what, sorry?
He's recently noticed that he started.
Oh, he's become aware of that.
So he started high school, diagnosed just before, and his mum's noticed that he's started masking now.
See, it's a really difficult. I suppose the first thing I'd say is for that mum to trust herself, because the kind of judgments you have to make about this, about when to, when not to, and all the different contexts, only a parent can make, no professional can make. So for the mum to have the confidence in herself and to assert the way she's going to protect her child in these situations. It's very difficult to stop your child from masking. I haven't really asked much about this, actually. I mean, what parents are often dealing with is, as you mentioned earlier, Sue, the aftermath of keeping everything, holding it together to do that, and then you either have a shutdown or you have a meltdown when you get home, especially going into high school. I suppose one of the things that I try and recommend, if it's available, is on returning home from school to do whatever the most powerful thing that relaxes your child. Now, I mean, for younger children, it could be waiting at the door with a bowl of slime. You know, so put your hands in, up to your bedroom and play Minecraft. You know, but
clean the slime off your hands.
Yes. But that's more of a kind of, you know, how do you recover better? But in terms of how to advise a child in year 7 who's just being exposed to the complexities and challenges of high school, well, they need protecting. I strongly recommend that the parent, together with the child and anybody else in the family, put together and document the reasonable adjustments the child needs to minimize their anxiety levels as much as possible, but with the proviso that whatever the ideas are, do not cause social exposure, because then it will just make things worse. So yes, we're going to do this for you. You know, it's like the typical thing a lot of people know, you know, if you're feeling stressed in the classroom, here's a card to hold up. You know, which nobody uses because it causes too much social exposure.
Well, sometimes people do, depending on how you ask them to use it. Yeah, because I mean, it could be if the teacher knows or the teachers know about it, and there is that timeout card. You get some children who will show it and are fine with that. But I think even just if it could be a case of, I don't know, sometimes we'll just put it on the desk, point to it, so it's not, or if it's, I don't know, hands up for other questions and just, it could be they're just going to the toilet. Sometimes they do work, but I think, I suppose it's going back to, because I think sometimes as well, from what I hear when you're speaking to schools, is if the school don't know as well that there's that the child's masking, and it might be, they might say, I didn't realise they were having all these problems at home, or that there was so much anxiety. So I think it's making sure that they're aware, and then again, like you said, agreeing those reasonable adjustments that are going to work for that young person, for the boy, that he's going to feel comfortable enough to access them, really. As well.
There are so many triggers at school, aren't there? So many. There's all the sensory triggers, whether it's the uniform or the noise levels or whatever. then you've got all the change, and school's pretty routine, isn't it? But for an autistic person, you know, not being able to sit in the same seat, or, you know, or might supply teachers, all minor changes may have a major impact on the child.
And I suppose it's the changes that with everyone else as well, like you say, is it supply teacher, and then everyone else in the class changes, don't you, because it's a different teacher. So necessarily people who would normally just be quiet around you are not, and stuff as well. So it can be difficult, but I suppose it's hard, isn't it, to say, like, you know, just talk to somebody about not masking, because going back to if you're in a new school, they're trying to get used to it all. You're just trying to do what you need to do to get through the day in a lot of ways. But I suppose, making sure that the school are aware as well. I
don't know, often if you think of the stress and anxiety building up throughout the school day, there are certain, I don't know whether it's possible, maybe it's easier at primary school than high school, but at primary school I suggest that you build in activities that the child loves to do, and they can do them on their own in quiet at certain points through the school day. So just to kind of bring down that anxiety and stress level, so it doesn't reach the same height as without those activities. And the same kind of principle could apply at high school. It depends on, as I say, you know, parents are the experts on the children. It's about discussing that with your child, and what ideally, in an ideal world, what would kind of work for them. But actually telling a child to stop masking. It's more of a, I don't know whether Luke Bearden in his 9 Degrees of Autism speaks about this, but you know, as part of your development as an autistic person, you know, just being totally on your own agenda, waking up to a social world around you and your responses to that, and all the other autistic sensitivities, and then getting into highly social environments with all sorts of other triggers and how you cope with that. I mean, we do meet some children, pupils on spectrum at high school, who are very much that they've got protective factors, that they are much more on their own agenda and uncompromising. It depends. It's true to say, isn't it, that when an autistic person wants to fit in socially, they are at their most vulnerable. They really are, because all you can be is compliant. Because you can't negotiate, you can't assert yourself. You can avoid and refuse or comply. There's no kind of middle ground there to kind of make life easier for yourself. So if the pupil is kind of quite uncompromising in that way, that's often protective. And if they have ADHD with it and are pretty active, that could be protective as well. So there are some naturally protective factors that sometimes come into this, but a lot of the time we see a lot of vulnerability, don't we? And it's about the school, from the very top of the school, from the senior leadership team downwards, being really interested in teaching and supporting children who are different. And if you have that, and they're listening to parents as the experts, you're much more likely to arrive at a solution for the child. But if you don't have that, well, you know, it's a resource issues, and everybody's so busy in every school I've ever been to, then there's more difficulties. So that's a very, very good question. And it's multifaceted, isn't it? But in the end, the parent is the best person to come up with the ideas. And negotiate that with the school as much as possible. Because in the end, what I always say is to use the wording, the school has to safeguard the child's mental health. And we all know that that is a much higher priority than any kind of academic attainment. So how do you safeguard the child's mental health to reduce the triggers, exposure to those triggers that cause all this anxiety? So I'll shut up now.
No, but I think it's right, isn't it? It's going back to sort of the working in partnership and letting the school know and trying to come to some reasonable adjustments that are hopefully going to help, whether they're going to carry on masking or not. But at least if school are aware that the masking, that, you know, they can try and help hopefully.
I don't know whether anybody's got a comment on this idea. I wonder whether, because masking kind of happens, I think, I don't know, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. If it's unconscious, then at home, with a really kind of positive outlook of what autism is and the autistic characteristics of your child, then the child developing an understanding of why they mask and you know, might actually be helped, because I think if it's all unconscious, I think that's more difficult, because you're shutting down or you're melting down. You don't know
not
why.
realising that they're doing it almost.
Yes.
I suppose people understanding why they do. I mean, you not long ago assessed a girl who was reading a book called A Kind of Spark, and I read it because I thought I'll see what it's like, and I thought that was a really good book. I gave it to Ali to see if they would have time to read it, to see their perspective on it.
Yes.
And I don't know yet. I don't know if they've had time to read it. No pressure. But yeah, I thought that was a really good book to read, maybe to sort of explain like the impact of masking and like sort of the impact of sensory issues. And I think it was, I just found it from a neurotypical perspective a really good way of explaining sort of, you know, people being aware of what they're doing and how that can be quite draining for them and why they're doing it. And actually it's not about them, it's about them fitting in with all these other people, and it's like, you know, them sort of recognizing it's not, you know, something that's wrong with them having to put this on. It's more like because all these other people need you to do it in some ways.
There's a real bias here, isn't there? Because I wish those. You're right. There's a few really good books about this. Unfortunately, they're aimed at girls and women.
Yeah.
When actually the boys need them as much.
Yes.
Yeah. Someone needs to write one.
Yeah.
Oh, Ellie said that the book is on their sofa, ready to read.
Yeah, no rush. It was only just to get your perspective on it, because you might think it's rubbish. But
I've come across a couple of other books by teenagers on the spectrum.
Yeah.
You know, the females. Just wish to.
Oh, the one I'm reading now as well. Oh, what's her name? I've lost it now. I started reading another book that's about looking at the science of people.
Oh, I know.
What's
I
her
know
name?
what you mean. I've got it.
Camille Pang.
Yeah, I've got
Is that it? That's really good. Talking about people like proteins.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah.
I've got it on audio.
Oh, have you? Yeah. No, it's good, isn't it?
It looks like we haven't got any further questions at the moment.
Sorry, can I just interrupt here? The book is called Explaining Humans.
That's it.
By Dr. Camilla Pang, who's on the spectrum, isn't she?
ADHD.
Yes. Explaining Humans.
That's a good book.
There's a book I've seen actually. It's I can't remember who the author is, but it's written by an author who was an ex-teacher, and it's also by, I think it was a 12 or 13-year-old girl on the spectrum as well. I think it's called Can You See Me?
I've seen that one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I started to read that one, and it seemed to be quite good. I think it talks about their personal experiences in real life as well. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah, and that's good. I think Luke's last book as well, I'm still reading that as well, which was Understanding Autistic Children. Linda, can you remember the title of Luke's?
I think it's more about managing anxiety, but we could certainly attach that to the presentation along with the excellent journal article that one of our participants has sent. I think it's called Managing Anxiety, but I did review the book. I had the privilege of reviewing the book before it came out, and although it says it's directed at children, I actually think it's applicable to all neurodiverse children and adults. So that's definitely worth reading. I suppose the other thing that I do that might be seen as a bit controversial is that I try and stress that school isn't the be-all and end-all. Apologies, Sue. It's only a part of
leaving school.
I mean, I suppose you know, for me, things like PE and sports were absolutely horrendous at school.
Wow.
just because you can't even run to get the train when you're late.
No,
it's the most
can't.
The funniest thing ever. Dad actually had her deliberately made her late so that just because he would get a right laugh watching her run to get the train.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out, son. So I suppose
the top half doesn't stop moving, and the bottom just doesn't. It's like someone walking in place, but somehow running forwards.
See, now that as an adult, I find that quite amusing, and I'm not at all offended by my son pointing that out. But at school, can you imagine what it was like if we were playing rounders?
Oh God, I couldn't do a sit-up.
Now, what I was very good at, I was very good in hockey at tackling people, and I used to beat their legs up.
With the stick.
Yeah, with the stick. So I suppose one of the things I try and say to children and parents is school only occupies, you know, now in my life, school was a very small part of my life. Massively important, yes, but I don't know how true this is, but there is a story about Steven Spielberg. I don't know if it's true, but apparently he didn't like school, and he didn't go to school on a number of occasions, and his mum got called into the school, and the head teacher said, "Mrs. Spielberg, you keep taking your son out of school and taking him to deserts to make video recordings. Your son will amount to nothing." And I really hope that's true.
I want to point out that I'm fairly convinced that one's a myth.
It probably is a myth, but let's believe it is true that, you know, actually she played to her son's strengths. I'm not advocating, Sue, that everyone takes their children out of school and does other things with them, but I suppose it's about giving a message to children that, you know, for some children, school has to be endured. Yes. And how can we make it less awful? What is being a success? What does that mean? I think being happy is, you know, sounds very naive, but I think it's about being happy.
But also we see so many parents that have had to protect their children by taking them out.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not uncommon, is it?
No, it's not.
You know, you're taking your... the school is focusing on something like attendance or something like that. And so parents say, I'm trying to get the child in, I don't being fined and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And then they just deregister.
But the thing is, a lot of the time, you know, I think in school you are kind of beaten with attendance and like your, you know, your form group where, you know, your attendance is great, you know, theirs isn't very good, name and shame that form. So I think
the irony is
kind of driven, you know, it's not necessarily them who.
It's Ofsted driven.
Yeah, well, it is.
Yeah.
It is, and you know, it's.
The irony being that Ofsted knows that fining people for late attendance or lack of attendance does not work. In fact, there was actually a scientific study done in Israel. Shut up, phone. That said that actually they took two schools and they fined parents for late attendance of one and they didn't fine them at another, and late attendance went up on the school that was fined.
Yeah, but I think again, I mean, schools are, you know, they do have certain things that they have to do, don't they, whether, you know, that the teachers and the head teachers and whoever like it or not. And I think, you know, it comes from obviously
more of an Ofsted problem than it is an education problem.
You know, I always stand by, I don't think anyone goes in to be a teacher if you don't want to help kids.
Yes.
No.
You don't.
No, far from it.
Elliot's posted a really important comment.
So yeah, basically what I wrote in it was I remember about school was the constant bullying and none of the teachers essentially doing anything about it. Thanks for the trauma, guys. Really appreciate it. And it's funny because essentially I now use nothing I learned from school in my job. So, hey.
Going back to, obviously, we're going to talk about reasonable adjustments as well. So they're sort of following on from Elliot's experience. And I know that, you know, sadly it is something that when I know when you're assessing people and from other people, that bullying is a big thing that comes up. And I think that it's horrible that it happens. And I know certainly for me as a teacher, I would always challenge bullying. I would hope that going forward that is, there's bullying policies in school and that they are used and that they are followed up and that things are challenged.
We hear quite a lot that they are. I mean, obviously we hear the cases that aren't, but I mean, that's why I sometimes think that specialist autism schools are a very, very good idea. I know the kind of special school system is kind of all over the place and very, very different in different areas and everything, and certainly not always appropriate. But ideally, a low aroused environment that can focus and teach on interests and all those things without sensory triggers and real and feeling safe. Somewhere where you can feel safe. Because the SEN world is being taken to court all over the place. I mean, the kind of scandals that are emerging on a daily. If you listen to email, there's a very good, it's called Special Needs Jungle. Always has very, very good news about legal status and what's happening with the SEN legally and with the government and provision, etc.
I mean, I suppose one of the good things that a lot of schools are changing now as well, like I suppose in making or trying to make things more accessible for everybody. And there's things like, I know a lot of primary schools have things like forest school and more active play and different options for people to learn. And I think as well, like a lot of sort of high schools as well are changing a bit. And there's like some that look very different, offer specialisms in different things. So, I mean, hopefully if that can carry on being the way forward and it appeals to a lot more different interests, as Calvin said, instead of, just always focusing on the things that, are deemed to be the core subjects that are going to get you a decent job, let people do what they like and what they enjoy and what they're good at. And I actually had a conversation with my niece the other day because she's really into her art and that side of things. And she said, why is it that seemed to be not as important as me doing English or German? And just talking a bit about multiple intelligences and how it takes, again, when people go out into the world and get jobs, there's things that, I'm as an English teacher, so I've always really liked English and reading and writing and that type of things, but there's certain things that I am absolutely rubbish at, like art, practical things that I'm just no good at, so you really need everyone to be able to focus on what they're good at. And I suppose going back to giving people more opportunities to do that as well.
Reese has left a good comment, and it says, my experience is that school only cares about children being able to regurgitate a textbook word for word on an exam paper, rather than teaching them important stuff about how the world works, like with taxes.
Yeah,
definitely.
That was one that used to come up quite a lot in school. Like, why are we learning all of this mess? And when we do things like, what was it, PSHA, and then we'd have like maybe one lesson on looking at like budgeting, like financial budgeting or something. Well, that's actually really important for people to know, and like how to get, when you're going to go and try and buy a house, how do you apply for a mortgage? How all these practical things that.
They don't teach it.
And then
I didn't really know about how to set up a direct debit when I first moved into my own place, which was really required. Why is that not a priority?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I suppose if we try and I know obviously we're hearing like some really negative experiences of school, and we do still hear them now. But I still might maintain that obviously working in partnership with school, if we can, is the best way forward.
Yeah, no, it's the classic. You don't change something. You don't always change something by railing against it. You can change something by working with it.
Correct.
Yeah, and I think going back to again, like if you think right at the very beginning when we were saying about why it is important to work with schools, maybe if you can try and work with schools to change it for people. Make them understand why things need to be changed. So if we go now to thinking about reasonable adjustments for people, which we sort of talked a little bit about before with the question from the mom whose son has just started high school and is masking. Again, I think it's sometimes reasonable adjustments can be really small, and I know that it's not taken away from the fact that school is going to be a stressful time, particularly if people are struggling with it, with sensory, anxiety, bullying, all these kinds of things. It's always going to be a difficult time. But I think it's, trying to discuss with the school what can they do or how can they help and what can they put in place that's going to try and make it that little bit easier. I mean, even down to things of, I suppose, thinking back to when I was in school, like having rooms available at lunchtime, places where people can go that's quiet, that they know they're not going to get a load of grief off somebody else on the corridor, where it's maybe a group of people who they know, you can all go there and just sit and just have the lunchtime, quite chilled and read a book, listen to some music, discuss what they want to discuss. So, there could be things like that school might already have or could put in place. I mean, I don't mean things like necessarily like little social groups where people are made to go and try and make friends with people or whatever, that might not always be what people want, but thinking about discussing with them. So sitting down and saying, what are you struggling with? What are the most difficult things for you? What can we do that realistically we can try and help you with? Whether it might even be, I mean, this is something that could be seen as maybe socially exposing, but I used to know quite a few of my students who'd like to leave like a couple of minutes before the bell just to get through the corridor.
Crowds. Yeah.
And I mean, people could see that that's what they were doing, but it'd be like, maybe who's going to go with you today? You two go and get off a couple of minutes before the bell.
I mean, sometimes I've been to some high schools, and there must be quite a few in the country, where they really have a substantial area of the infrastructure cordoned off, if you like, or as a special learning area with small classrooms that can take 6 and quiet areas where you can go at lunchtimes, and they're protected. So only certain pupils are allowed in there, like a school within a school. That's been very effective and a safe place for autistic pupils.
But I think even just down to, I mean, a lot of the teachers spend a lot of the time doing sort of lunchtime clubs and things for different groups, and in my experience it generally ends up the same people go to the certain clubs, and you might get somebody else who'll drop in or out, or who's made to go to it because they haven't done the homework or something like that. But I just think really discussing with what can be put in place and giving suggestions as well, and maybe not every suggestion can be put into place by the school, but coming to an agreement of what sort of things actually can be consistently put in place that are hopefully going to help to make it a little bit easier. If you can't make it perfect, like you say, for some people it is, it is not a good experience for them and not what they want to be doing, but it's just about what can you try and do to make it easier.
Yes.
If you'd like to go ahead, Linda.
I suppose before Sue was appointed, I think Dave, you and I were probably not anti-school, that's probably too strong, but probably moaning quite a lot about schools.
We did a lot, yeah.
We did. And I kept moaning about, well, I've asked them for information and they haven't given it to us. And then when Sue came on board, and I agree with you, Calvin, this is about working with, not against. So sometimes I'd be saying, well, I asked for this information, and Sue would say to me, do you realise that's the last Friday before the 6-week school holidays? How on earth do you think a teacher's going to do that? Or do you realise this is this particular exam time? So I had no idea really about what schools are dealing with. I just expected them to respond when I wanted, which is classic expert model, really. So I think the fact that there are challenges, but I think I agree with you, Dave. I think the fact that Tracy and Sue are using these words like masking, I think, good teachers are going off and researching it and looking at it and thinking, yeah, I get that. And recently, in 2 assessments recently, we've had teachers actively involved in the diagnosis, which has been incredible.
Brilliant. Yeah.
So I think it's, as you said, Cal, it's about working with, not against, and also understanding that, you know, teachers do have expertise, and if we adopt an expert model, we're not going to get that expertise. So I'm hopeful, as a couple of people in the chat are, that things are changing for the better and people are listening. So thank you, Sue, for coming on board and helping us, because it wasn't good, Dave, was it?
No, totally. Yeah, you've changed things around massively.
Yeah. Which proved, you know, the partnership model works.
Well, I think this has been a really interesting session. So thank you very much for everyone's comments, and for Sue and David for leading on this one. If there's nothing else, thank you everybody for coming. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening and participating. Thank you, Kieran, for organising.
Yes.
Welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran.
Yeah.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Okay.
Thank
Bye-bye
you.
now.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.